Okay, I'm going to go ahead and call this meeting to order. So my name is Aaron Sandine. I am the State CIO and Deputy Director for the Department of Administration. Justin, do you want to go ahead and take roll?
Certainly. Commissioner Sandine. Joe Anderson. Here. Michael Brazier. Amy Brooks. Stephen Campbell. Present. Jan Howe. Tracy Montgomery.
Present.
Gilbert Dorantia. Here. William Pribble. Patrick Quinn. Kathleen Robinson. Dan Will. Dwayne Woody.
Here.
Dan, did you hear me? Dan, are you on mute? And Mike Worrell. Dan, can you hear me okay? Are you, Dan? We are actually, once Dan comes back on, we'll be one shy of a quorum, so if I could recommend we skip ahead to the information items with Arizona Department of Homeland Security update, and then once we have enough quorum, we can return.
Absolutely. Thank you, Justin. So, Lisa?
Good afternoon, Commissioners and attendees. Thank you very much. My name is Lisa Hansen. For those of you that don't know me, I'm the Assistant Director for Arizona Homeland Security. And my presentation today is basically an update of where we're at with Arizona Homeland Security and the current grants and upcoming grants. Currently, the 2010 period of performance for grants, our period of performance is ending on 9/30/11. So reallocations are in process for those grants if extensions have not been granted to the extending grants. The 2011 grants, the period of performance on those, we're about halfway through. So grants for that period of performance will end on September the 30th of 12. The 2012 grant guidance, guess what? It's releasing on Friday. So we should know dollars for what we'll be looking for in this upcoming grant year this coming Friday. There's an additional information. We'll talk about the 2013 budget, and there was a presentation yesterday that's made towards the 2013 budget, and we'll talk about that. We had grant informational seminars in the South, Central, and in Flagstaff the week of February the 20th.
Okay.
Is that Dan?
Yes, I'm reconnected.
Thank you, Dan.
Hi, Dan. The grant applications for the 2012 grant application process are due to Arizona Homeland Security by 5 o'clock on March the 2nd of just next month. The tentative period of performance for that funding cycle will be October 1 through September the 30th of 2013, which is a 12-month period of performance. Just to kind of give you an overview of where the grants have gone, here's a little bit of history from 2009, 10, and then 11, and we will find out what 12 numbers are. You can see a significant reduction in the Homeland Security Grant Program, the Phoenix-Uwasi, and unfortunately the Tucson-Uwasi in 2011 became an unfunded Uwasi at that point. So we took a significant hit, about a 50% cut in the SHISHCAB program. And then the Phoenix-Uwasi took a significant hit. Tucson, 100%. MMRF and Citizen Corps pretty much held strong. The Operation Stone Garden, we'll talk about that. They received approximately $13 million, which was consistent from the previous year. In relationship to the grant program, we have what's called the State Preparedness Report, the SPR. It's taken a few different life forms over the last several years. The newest version, we received a draft of that in the November timeframe. Arizona Homeland Security put together and completed this mission to the federal government by the due date in December of 2011. Upcoming for this year is there is a new tool or a revised tool that will come out, and it should be out in about June of 2012. The intent behind that is we will submit that to stakeholders and county-level submissions, so every county will be completing something very similar. Many of you that have participated in past years, we've done a target capabilities assessment. This basically is that. The target capabilities is being replaced with what's called the core capabilities. And the core capabilities is embedded within the SPR tool. So that assessment is forthcoming. At the workshops that we had for the grant seminars, we encouraged every stakeholder. If the stakeholder is applying for grant funds, they're applying for funds to build the capabilities and the gaps that we've identified in these tools. So if they're seeking money, they should be a part of the process as far as building what our SPR looks like. 2012 grant guidance. Yesterday there was a presentation that was made by Secretary Napolitano in reference to the vision and grant guidance for this upcoming year. So here's some insight that we received yesterday. The 2012 grant guidance, which we said is supposed to be released on this Friday, which will show us the dollars, is going to begin the transition from 16 separate grant programs to a more streamlined model. It will implement a new period of performance at the state level, which previously had been at 3 years and reduced it to 2 years. We currently provide our stakeholders with a 12-month period of performance with a possibility of extensions, but at the federal level, the concept and idea of drawing down those funds is being played through in our new process. So the federal focus on drawdowns on current funds. In addition to drawing down those current funds, the federal extensions that were previously given to grants are coming to a day of no more. The fiscal year 8 and 9 must be expended by September the 30th of 2012, and it says must. Very highlighted that it is changing forms. The new grant that we're looking at for 2013 is a complete rewrite. So when we talked about streamlining the process from 16 grants down to 1, this is it is the National Preparedness Grant Program, NPGP. So that's going to take a lot of change between the 12 process and the 13 process. It's going to focus on supporting all of the changes that actually support PPD 8. It helps to support Congress's request for information and how are we pulling down the dollars and how do they support our capabilities. In addition to that, we know that it's going to be an allocation-based and a competitive-based grant. But what we don't know is how much is going to be allocation-based and how much is going to be competitive. That's still unknown at this time. The National Preparedness Grant Program will also focus on what's called the DARA, which is the Threat Hazardous Identification and Risk Assessment. Right now the federal government has not released the requirements for that, but Arizona Homeland Security is preparing for that, and we've already had numerous work sessions to get prepared for that. So as soon as the requirements drop, we will be writing that THERA and submitting that to the federal government. Changes from the previous years. And this is directly off of the presentation that was provided by Janet Napolitano. Basically, it's evaluating national preparedness capabilities by focusing on regional and national capabilities and assets. What this is a significant change is in historically being a part of the EMAC, the compact for Arizona, was advised and recommended by Arizona Homeland Security and by the federal government. In the 2013 process, we will see that as a mandatory. Just like NIMS-CAST is mandatory, the EMAC will be mandatory. So you'll see a significant drive on educating stakeholders and getting them focused on joining that EMAC, because all of the funding and the capabilities that are supported with 2013 will need to be eligible for deployment statewide or nationwide. Now we'll talk about just some interoperability grants. PSCC grant was awarded in 2007. It was $17.7 million. To date, $15.8 million has been reimbursed. Federal legislation approved an extension for the period of performance on that. We, the state of Arizona, requested that extension currently has an extension until 5/31 of 12, of which they will be completing that and 100% reimbursing that grant. So it's well underway to its completion and fruition on that PSCC $17.7 million. The AZPSIC grant, the Border Interoperability Demonstration Program, UMA received just under $4 million. That's actually a grant that's awarded in $3 amounts over a 3-year period. So they've received the first funding, which was about $1.5 million, and we just recently in January received the EHP approval for that. So we are marching down the road with that, and it seems to be moving 100% on track. So for interoperability, how does interoperability tie to the Homeland Security Grant Program? In 2011, 29% of all the grant funds were dedicated towards interoperability projects. 29% of all the grant funding was dedicated. That's significant. We relate a big portion of that to the requirements for narrowbanding. And we see the need and the concepts behind that, and so do the RACs that make recommendations in the UASI for this. What was interesting was the direct tribal award. 65% of the funding that was received to the 3 tribes, which we consider Fort Mojave to be an Arizona tribe, was 65% of their funding that was awarded in 2011 focused on interoperability solutions. Just to kind of give you, here's a picture and a breakdown of the funding streams. SHISHGAP funding stream, the Homeland Security Grant Program, was awarded $6.6 million, and 34% of that was focused on interoperability. Phoenix UASI was about 1%. The Operation Stone Garden Grant, which is along the southern border, which is predominantly focuses on boots on the ground, first responders, assisting Border Patrol with their mission on border security. Still, 14% of that funding stream is focused on interoperability solutions along the border. The direct tribal funding, which we talked about, was 65% focused on this, and of course the AZPSIC was 100% focused on interoperability solutions. So we will continue to strive and assist the stakeholders on moving forward with interoperability. And we will be updating everyone as far as the 2012 grant funding cycle, which will come out. Funding announcements will be released on Friday, and we will be having funding RAC meetings shortly hereafter. Those will be on schedule for later in March and early April will be the RAC funding meetings to do recommendations for the 2012 funding cycle. Any questions?
Thank you. Lisa Meyerson, PSCC. In terms of the EMAP, do you have any sense of where we are in terms of number of jurisdictions within Arizona that are currently members of the EMAP?
The EMAP process is actually administered by the Arizona Department of Emergency Management, and MAP Parks is responsible for that process. I do not have those numbers offhand, but I can add those from MAP Parks. We'll be working with him over the next upcoming months to solidify that and share that information with all of our stakeholders.
And second question would be, I noticed IACGP, and we've heard it's not being funded yet, but I didn't notice it up there for some of the past year. That's because that's folded into SHISHGAP.
The IACGP was a funding stream that did not receive funding in the past year. We've got some ongoing grants that we're reimbursing today, but we do not anticipate seeing any new funding coming out for that program. The eligibility to apply for concepts allowable under IACGP may be applied for under the State Homeland Security Grant Program as a consolidated process.
Any other questions? Thank you very much. Kathleen, did you join us?
Yes, I did. Sorry for being late. We had State of the City today.
Totally appreciate it. Thank you very much, Kathleen. With Kathleen joining, we now have a quorum. I'd like to go back and ask for a motion to approve the minutes.
Steve Gamble, I'll make a motion to approve the minutes for the meeting of September 20th, 2011.
Thank you, Steve. Second?
Second, Jill Rocky.
Thank you. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Aye. Aye.
The minutes are approved. The next agenda item is...
Chairman Cindy?
Yes.
I'm sorry, I actually also have the November 23rd.
Oh, thank you. All right, so that was September. Thank you, Justin, for keeping this in mind. Can I get a motion on the November 23rd meeting minutes?
So I understand, I'll make that motion.
Tracy Montgomery, second.
Thank you. All those in favor to approve?
Aye.
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 November meeting minutes are approved. Okay, moving on to the next agenda item. This is an action item, revisions to the Arizona Interoperable Communications Plan. Michael Britt.
Okay. All right, the Interoperable Channels Plan were last updated August 16th. After we published them, we got feedback that there was some changes that could be made to reduce confusion, especially in the context of working with federal agencies. These changes are to rename AZPSIC 95 and AZPSIC 95D, and to replace VTAC, the repeater pair VTAC 3334 with 3637. Okay. These changes have been discussed with the Interoperable Channels Plan Working Group and were approved by the SIAC on January 11th, and they're up for your approval today. On the AZPSIC 95 and AZPSIC 95D, it's an Arizona-only interoperable channel, but the naming convention we were using made it look very much like the national interop channels in the 800 megahertz, AZPSIC 91, AZPSIC 92, etc. During the Vital Connections exercise, it was reported back to us that some of the participants were actually trying to look up AZPSIC 95 in the NIPOC, in the National Interoperable Field Guide. So we have proof positive that there was some confusion going on with our naming convention. In discussions with the NIPSIC Interoperable Committee, they also are considering expanding the use into the upper channel realm so we would directly overlap with the NIPOC if we stuck with AZPSIC 95. So we proposed to change it from AZPSIC 95 and 95D to 8AZTAC 5 and 8AZTAC 5D. The 5 is kind of a throwback to our previous naming conventions under the SIAC protocols and was agreed to by the Interoperable Channel Plan Working Group. So that is simply a name change, no change to frequency in terms of programming radios. It's just the display on the radio. The frequencies stay the same. So this is in reference to our priority programming guide that we distribute along with the channel plan. On the repeater pairs, we had chosen VTAC 33 and 34. We got feedback, again, from the national level that the preference is to have high-end and low-out on the repeater pairs. Ours ends up being low-end, high-out. And so if we switch to VTAC 3637, we'll be more in keeping with the national protocols. This requires a change in naming and also switching around the frequencies for receive and transmit. They're the same frequencies as were described under the 3334, but they've just switched places in terms of receive and transmit are now transmit and receive. All right, so those are the two proposed changes to the channel plan, and we'd like to seek your approval.
Any questions for Mike?
Mike, this is Dan Wills. The 3334 are the reverses of, 3637, aren't they?
Correct.
We don't need to change naming on them. We just use those other channel assignments.
Well, I just meant the naming in the display to be VTAC 3637.
Correct. Okay, well, we don't need to modify those. Okay.
Well, we actually, in our channel plan, Dan, we did not have 3637 called out. So we don't...
Right. Okay.
Okay.
Right. I got you.
Got it.
Other questions for Mike? Okay. So, Mike, do we need to take action on each one separately or both together?
This would be done both together for
Both
the
together.
entire general plan.
Okay.
Dan Wells, I make a motion. We accept the changes as submitted.
Thank you very much, Mike.
Steve Campbell, second.
Thank you. All those in favor?
Aye.
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 This action passes. Thank you very much, Michael.
Okay.
Next on the agenda is an SIEC update. Mark and Paul.
David Felix and Bill action item, I think.
Oh, sorry. Thank you.
Okay. You messed with your...
Yeah, I'm bouncing around.
Yeah.
I am bouncing around. So RWC, TRWC, and the 2017 FCC deadline for 700 megahertz narrowbanding.
Good afternoon. I'm David Felix, the Executive Director of the Regional Wireless Cooperative, which is, as many of you know, represents 18 towns, cities, and fire districts here in the metropolitan Phoenix area. And I'm here to request your support. I briefed the SIEC sometime back on this issue, so some of you may have heard something a little bit about it, or in the case of Chief Campbell, for example, I think he's been beat to death with this in our board meetings, but I will give you a high-level overview of what this issue is and then request your support. Not to be confused with the nightmare of the 2013 narrowbanding issue. It is somewhat similar, but different. The Federal Communications Commission, FCC, mandates that all 700 megahertz public safety equipment must be narrowbanded by December 31st, 2016, or we refer to it as the 2017 deadline. Very similar to what is going on with narrowbanding UHF and VHF. The impact of this mandate is the potential of losing seamless wide area roaming for the RWC and possibly the TRWC, which employ a mixed 700 and 800 megahertz system. The reason for this is, without going into all the real technical details that I've heard, is we would have two different protocols on the system. To narrowband 700 requires moving to a protocol which is referred to as TDMA, time division multiple access. Currently, we are using FDMA, which is referred to as frequency division multiple access. Those two protocols can exist on the same system. However, the ability to seamlessly roam from one site to another is not. You're no longer capable of doing that. Similar to saying if you had to take your cell phone and know where you were every minute you were moving around the city, you would have to change a dial to be able to communicate, for example, back to your dispatch center. And of course, you know, this goes without saying that maintaining government services and the ability to maintain these systems is very, very challenging in the best of circumstances, let alone in the stressful budgetary environments we're all in. So the system changes of this type require long-term planning, minimum 5 years. We have a technical plan that goes out 5 years, or much longer when these kind of changes occur that makes it even more difficult. We're looking at today, best estimates, at $51 million for the RWC, and similar numbers associated with systems across the country. That doesn't account for over $100 million in subscriber units. So our radios, consoles to our individual members will almost be double what the infrastructure cost is to RWC members. And the subscriber units that would have to be upgraded or replaced by our interoperability participants in the RWC alone probably is pushing 40 participants that would have to change out their radios to be able to continue to operate on the system once we make that transition. So this rule requires that a majority of the existing system equipment is not just updated, it has to be converted. So we are converting entirely over to 700 megahertz from 8. So this, for these reasons, the supporting agencies that we've identified on the petition that I believe you've been given, and are requesting that when it says the commission, we're referring to the FCC, modify their current rules for spectrum efficiency to move that deadline from 2016 out to some date in the future. We're kind of open on what that might be. We believe that we probably could get at least a 2-year delay, but we're asking for something even more than that, and that is for us regionally to be able to make that determination when that needs to take place. So today, these are the participating agencies that we've asked for support, and I believe for the most part we've gotten tentative support and signature, or we'll get signatures on the petition once that's been completed. It's undergoing a final review today. Regional Wireless Cooperative, Topaz Regional Wireless Cooperative, the Department of Public Safety, Maricopa County, the Yuma Regional Communications System, the PSCC, and we also have approval today and support from the 700 MHz Region 3 Planning Committee. Some of the points for consideration in the petition talk about the following. The 700 MHz frequencies are allocated effectively and used efficiently today in Region 3. So we believe that this mandate can be moved out. We don't have an urgent need for the change today. The TDMA standards have not been fully completed, and what happens here is that particularly subscriber equipment is not in wide use or availability to our members. So when you look at competitive pricing and some of the things associated with the new equipment, it might only reside with a couple of different vendors. So because those standards have just been ratified, manufacturers now have to meet those standards and start building equipment. Product life cycles, costs, and availability are such that agencies are significantly challenged to maintain their infrastructure and subscribers in sound up-to-date working order. This is just the cost that they laid out. $51 million in infrastructure, over $100 million in the subscriber equipment. Frequency management, including narrowbanding, is best managed regionally. We believe that the local agencies, along with our Region 3 RPC, should be the ones to make a recommendation or determine when to narrowband. Today, we don't have this desperate need for additional frequencies because 700 megahertz has not been widely deployed in Arizona, for example. Unlike the East Coast, which has a lot of 700, and in fact probably should narrowband because of the limitation of the spectrum. TDMA conversions for systems using a combination of 7 and 800 like ours require more changes than just to the 700 frequencies. We have to transition the entire system to 700. So, what we're recommending and requesting is that this petition to the FCCC to extend narrowbanding deadline to be listed as a participating agency. We're asking the Commission on supporting the RWC primarily in our petition, act as a signatory on our petition that's been provided to you. A couple of updates that I want to provide you with, and I think some of this will be covered in one of the other items you have on your agenda, is that this whole issue of D-Block and the National Broadband Network kind of put a spin into this. Initially, we thought that we would file a petition. There are others out there, particularly from the states of Missouri and Louisiana, the FCC has before them. They would go into publishing a notice of public rulemaking. We thought that would occur by the end of last year or the first part of this year. That's now been delayed because of the language that's been proposed in some of the D-Block legislation, federal legislation, that would require a give-back of 700 narrowband in the future. So the FCC essentially has put all these issues dealing with narrowbanding 700 on hold until such time as that language has been resolved. We have the majority of national public safety agencies or associations that have opposed that language and requested additional funding to include Senator McCain. So today, what we are doing is twofold. One is that we're going to file this larger petition on behalf of the region. But in the short term, we are going to file what's referred to as a request for expedited review by the FCC. The Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau apparently is, our understanding, is empowered to act on some of these for single areas, single states, single entities. So we're in the process of filing that today so that that will take action, or they will be responding to that while the other larger petition is being filed and it runs through their normal process. So it's kind of a two-pronged approach, what we refer to as, or I heard someone refer to as a belt and suspender approach. If one doesn't work, the other one hopefully will. So Again, I don't know if Dale Shaw was on the line, if you wanted to comment on the TRWC's position on this, but Mr. Chairman, members of the Commission, we basically ask for your support of this as a signatory on the petition, which we anticipate will be filed within the next 30 days.
Kathleen Robinson. Dave, do you have any idea how long it will take them to get back to us?
Too bad you can't see me, I smile. Let me say 2 words. Let me give you 2 words that probably will answer that question. Federal government. I was pretty optimistic about pushing this issue, Chief, really hard, and continue to do that with the expectation by our next budgetary planning cycle, which would be November this year, we would have an answer. I've been assured that probably won't happen by the time they go through their whole process of requesting public comments, replies, and then finally putting it on their agenda and addressing it. But I just received yesterday a request from the state of Idaho, who is as concerned about this as we are, and was requesting to make use of some of the language in our petition for one that they're going to file. So it's just starting to really, I think, start to develop this tsunami wave with different regions, and I think hopefully that will cause some pressure to get the change made. But to the answer to your question, I really don't know. My best hope would be before the end of the year.
Okay, thank you.
Good afternoon, Mr. Felix. Good afternoon. Thank you for your presentation. Just a quick question. Gil Arante here, Arizona Homeland Security. What is your sense with regard to the FCC and this petition? Do you have a feeling or a sense about whether this will be successful or not? I'm hearing, just the sense that I get from you is that if this isn't done, we've got some issues, some serious issues. What do you feel that the chances of success are?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Arante, I think they're pretty good. One reason is that as I understand, the digital TV transition was about 2 years delayed. So it would make sense that agencies couldn't get on to 700 in certain parts of the country, even if they wanted to, because the TV transition hadn't occurred. So we believe that at least there'll be a 2-year delay or 2-year extension at a minimum. I think the chances are pretty good. I met with FCC staff back in November. They said, or rather back in October in D.C., and they said, hey, we hear you. We're hearing this now. It's just that with the other narrow-banding issues and some other things they were dealing with, it just hadn't got on their radar screen quite the way that some of the other issues that have more of a priority. So I believe the chances of them either giving us an extension or a waiver are pretty good. My concern is when would that happen? Just a whole process, and then when we have this broadband issue come up, it delayed it even further. So we're going to proceed, and my hope is we keep the pressure on it. We'll get an answer because it's not just affecting our region. The fallback position is one. For example, the TRWC has been planning for this, and it seems to be in pretty good shape to be able to meet that deadline. We are not so similarly situated just because of the large amount of money facing us, and so we're looking at several other options to include some type of a lease purchase agreement so that we can still accomplish this if we had to. But our best hope is that we'll be able to extend that out for 6 to 8 years.
I have noticed that in your petition you're asking for a 2020 push back to 2020.
Yes.
Hopefully somewhere in there is where you'd like to land, obviously.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Arante, we would like to just have it waived and leave the option to the Region 3 to work with their members on this, but that seemed to be reasonable. We've seen petitions that are asking for a delay out to 2025. So we thought that 2020 was reasonable, and our members seem to be pretty happy with that, if we could get that extension.
Thank you.
Other questions?
Thank you. Yeah, Steve Campbell. Mr. Felix, just a clarification. When we talk about multiple petitions requesting similar things, are we similar in fashion, not only just asking for the date to be pushed down, but also the fact that these regional issues, like the narrowband, be done at a regional issue, so are our petitions consistent with everybody else that we have contact with?
Mr. Chairman, Chief Campbell, yes. It might be a little different twist. For example, the state of Louisiana, did a wide deployment of this. There seems to be more desperate because their equipment is fairly new and they don't want to have to go through this again, but the basic elements are about the same. The only thing I've seen that's unique about ours is this request for us to be able to manage this locally. through our Region 3 Regional Planning Committee. That seems to be different than the other petitions, but most of the language in the other petitions is very similar.
Okay. Thank you.
Excellent. Other questions?
Mr. Chair, just a point of clarification, please. Just for protocols, if we're going to put this to a vote, call for it. Because I am a member of the RWC, voting member, I just want to disclose that obviously I voted during that particular time, and just wondering if there's no conflict where I might continue to vote on this commission.
Okay. Thank you for that point of interest.
This Dan Wells had a question.
Yes, please, Dan.
David, do you feel that there's any danger in making that variance for local control that will make that petition different from the others? In other words, would we be better to align with the remainder of the petitions rather than calling ours out as separate?
Mr. Chairman, Dan, I don't think so. Each one is a little bit unique and different, and in fact address something that they believe is unique to their region. So I don't know that they necessarily have to be carbon copied from each other. I think that it will actually enhance ours in some ways. I'm very comfortable with that language. And in fact, if they didn't want to act on that and they just wanted to set an arbitrary date out there, they certainly could, and just not allow us that kind of flexibility.
Yeah, I think the longest date possible is certainly in our interest, given that all the funded conversations about mission critical LTE voice and everything else. We have no idea where this is going, and to go into some intermediate step in a few years just seems foolhardy. So I think this is a good move for us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Justin, just to clarify, so I don't know what your thought is as far as Stephen supporting this, and if so, we're short a member for a quorum then?
Yeah,
but just for okay.
I believe there probably would not likely be a conflict.
Okay.
And let me just check. Mike Brazier had let me know his CAD system was down. Commissioner Brazier, have you been able to join yet? So he has not quite joined yet.
So yeah, even if you abstain, but yeah, I don't think there's a conflict either.
Sure
yeah, no, I appreciate bringing that up though. So, any other comments or questions?
Just a point of clarification. I understand with PSCC office. We met with Dave several times on this. We've been following this nationally. We've been hearing out of some of our contacts at the national level that there is some movement afoot to look at an overall extension of this date, which we've talked about. However, we do think that it's because of the delays that have happened with DLOC and a lot of the politics that have been thrown around this issue, that we think it's prudent not to wait and pray that there's going to be an extension, but instead to act now, because it does take a long time. And the number of people that start asking for these petitions will probably have an influence on whether or not they're persuaded by a lot of the national groups that are lobbying them to push the deadline out for everybody. So we think it's a good move, generally. Good strategy.
Given that, can I get a motion to approve the request to be listed as a supporting entity?
Tracy Montgomery, tell me.
Thank you.
Second.
Thank you. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Aye.
This motion passes.
Is there anybody opposed? With the phone, it's hard to
there was all three. It was there. So anyone opposed, just to clarify?
Mr. Chairman, commission members, thank you.
Thank you very much, David. Excellent. So next on the agenda is an SIEC update.
Hi, Mr. Chair, Commissioners. This is Mark Kennedy, co-chair of the SIEC. Paul couldn't make it today, so I'm here to entertain. Go ahead. The other direction. Other direction. Okay, Okay, we've had 2 meetings, so we don't hear. Maybe that's why I was a little confused. Because I was going to say our last meeting was over at Commissioner Anderson's neck of the woods, Chief Anderson. We were in Bullhead on January 11th, but also been down here October 18th. See, the reason we were over in Bullhead was to kind of tie it in with the Arizona Ambulance Association meeting down here, Fire Districts Association. And I must say that meeting was very well attended, much better than I expected as we were over there. A little bit of funding problems, but we improvised, adapted, and overcame. So that's what's good about communications, right? So we're going to cover a few of the things that we discussed at our other meetings, and I may look to my board of experts here on some of their presentations to fill in some of the gaps. We did have a presentation from Susan on the comm unit training coordination procedure. Really, I think, other than me reading the whole thing, she is more tied in with coming more in alignment with the OEC and the FEMA standards. It's a 4-day class now instead of a 3-day class. It's just how the paperwork is going to flow. It just is much smoother. And along with that, I would say, and I think we may have it on a later slide, we've also had a COML instructor program where 6 of our COML, we have 6 more COML instructors besides them. But I think that's a later slide. We also discussed the interoperable channel plan, which you just covered, presentation before last, so I won't get into that again, but we thought that was a good news. Appreciate your support on that also. Had quite a bit of discussion on CHASM and making sure the data's in. I believe have had several people now sign up for access and are putting more information in. I know Coconino County specifically, because we had the TICP technical assistance grant, that a lot of folks up north are really working on it. So that's something that's coming along. We need more input. We want to get that, keep that as up to date as possible. Also, with all the activity, Jesse Cooper has been the primary administrative manager since the beginning, I think, of CHASM, and that's now transitioned over to Justin, so he can take control of that. Let's see. I'm hitting all the wrong buttons here. On the regional communication systems connections update, that actually it was just an update to us to talk about trying to get all the regional committees together, DPS and Maricopa County, to have some sort of a interoperable system, recognizing the size of it just really have to be focused on command and control, so that they have to work with this, and they're getting final IGA. So hopefully at our next meeting we'll have an update on that. This is where the NIMS communications work updates are, that we did have the instructors come through. We had some more courses going on, 3 all-hazards COML courses that went on through the winter, Phoenix came to Tucson. There's also the COM-T course in Tucson, additional FEMA COML course, which is being held, just finished in Glendale, so it was last week. And we are still planning on, I believe, a field day to try and get some of the folks who have gone through the COML courses to come down, all get together for we're calling it a field day, to help meet a lot of the requirements of their task books, because there's some of them that haven't had the opportunity to get in and work their task books. Our other presentations were an update on the statewide card exercise, which you can see there. We've requested input from the 2012 TAs, and that has information on that. Dr. Felix on the, I didn't touch it that time. Director Felix on the TRWC narrowbanding, and then next, I believe, you're going to hear from Justin on the narrowbanding 1 year ago presentation. So I will repeat that. Our next meeting is March 13th in this room. We have a few things on our agenda. We did talk briefly about the minimum equipment standards, and again, that wasn't me. See, I'm clearly away from the podium. But we thought we'd talk board at our next meeting, just to make sure there's no modifications we need to be made in what is listed currently in the plan. And we're anxious to hear on the drive test results from the AIRS program. That sounds that was quite an operation, but I'm really interested to see what the coverage looks like once all the data is put together. So then we'll see where we need to go forward with an AIRS plan and get an update on SCIP. More work group update stuff, see if we have any more comments that we can approve, and we'll see what else comes up. Any questions?
Any questions on the phone?
No.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Justin?
Just in case nobody knows. Thank you. Commissioners, all thank you. My first presentation today is on narrowbanding. We are now less than 1 year to go, and so we wanted to provide another update to the Commission today on where things stand in Arizona and the progress that's been made and some of the challenges that we have to meeting the narrowband deadline before January 1st of next year. I will preface all of this presentation with, we're not actually going to go through every one of the slides here because we know we've talked with you an awful lot about narrowbanding. And there are an awful lot of references in this slide to online resources. So the presentation was designed in mind both for you today, but also to be a resource online for people to go and find out more information. But I'm going to do just a brief overview on narrowbanding, where we stand from a national standpoint, where Arizona stands, and some of the options for meeting the mandate and cost considerations, those types of things. Obviously, this narrowbanding we're referring to is the VHF-UHF narrowbanding from 25 kilohertz down to 12.5 kilohertz. This has been delayed numerous years, and we're now set January 1st, 2013. The FCC has said over and over again, this will not be moved. Last July, the FCC issued public guidance on how to request a waiver, and they actually have asked that waiver requests be sent in by the end of 2011. Therefore, anyone or any systems that do not believe they're going to meet this deadline need to have their waiver submitted as soon as possible. They should immediately contact the FCC's Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau, and again, that link is clickable to begin the process of informing them. One thing I would mention is that they have stated in several national meetings that the waiver process is not going to be a routine approval process. They expect to see project plans for how the mandate will be met. They expect a deadline for when you'll be able to make it. They expect to see your proposed funding for it. One of the key things that we've been hearing in national presentations is the lack of funding is not going to be considered a viable reason for delay. If it's simply a matter of you've got the funding but it's over the next 2 years, they'll look at that. But simply not requesting funding and not taking advantage of the last 10 years worth of budget cycles and grant cycles is not going to be a valid reason for approval. The consequences for failing to meet the deadline, and again, this is something the FCC has consistently been discussing, $16,000 for each violation, $112,500 for any single act or failure to act. The complaint or the violation process from the FCC standpoint is going to be complaint driven. When a license begins to interfere with another license that's been granted authority to operate on narrowband spectrum next to the wideband spectrum, and if you're causing interference, then and a complaint is filed, then they will go out and begin enforcement action. The FCC does not want to have to go through the process of revoking licenses because that involves hearings on their part. whereas by going through the enforcement and fine operations, they can move a little bit quicker on that. From a national progress to date, beginning back in July 2010, you can see that from a narrowband only status, the column on the far right there, we were less than 15% of the nation was in that narrowband only, and less than, about 13% were modified their license to be both wideband and narrowband. Moving forward, you can see that's kind of gone up there. We're about 20% now nationally are narrowband only, with another 32%, 33% that are in transition. So less than 46% of the nation has not even begun the process. But again, that's almost 50% of the nation has not even started the narrowband process of requesting license modifications. One of the factors I do want to call out, if you notice, the total number of licenses also continues to drop. One of the reasons for that is we're seeing a lot of systems migrate from UHF or VHF to digital systems or 7800 systems. So that's why you'll see that decrease, in particular, a big decrease over the last several months. From Arizona's standpoint, we're doing a little bit better than the national trend, at least in terms of making progress. Only 16% of Arizona is now completely narrow-banded, but we've got another 54% that are within that transition. So less than 30% of the public safety VHF, UHF systems, and this is only public safety that I'm referring to here, or public safety licenses, have not begun the process. So we're making progress, but as you can see from the map, there's still an awful lot of red there. Kind of the breakdown here by region, Central, East, etc. Overall, it's roughly equivalent. The Central region, and I should indicate, since it's probably not completely obvious here, that does not include the RWC, TRWC systems. Those are 7-800. These are simply all the other systems within this region that do not operate on those 7-800. But yeah, overall, solid progress, particularly from the eastern and western regions. Wrong governing body. This is the standpoint in terms of the number of transmitters. Again, a lot of the transmitters we're making much better progress on. So beginning in January, 1st of January, we sent out a survey to all license holders in the FCC database and requested a fairly high-level survey, about 13 questions, asking about the status of their narrowbanding, what their plans were they going to request a waiver, have they received funds. We got back 115 responses by the end of January. I will indicate, as you see below, that this was not a scientific survey. It was much more of an informational type of survey standpoint. There are a tremendous more number of different public safety agencies I get responses from. But from a high level, fairly good progress being made on the status of narrowbanding from the respondents. The nice thing about this is the high number of people indicating that they're either completed or they're somewhere in the implementation phase. And we did define implementation phase as they've begun the planning process, they've gotten funding identified, those types of things. Planning down there, and again, that's a rather high number. From a planning standpoint was, if they haven't yet identified a funding source to be able to begin the narrowband process, then they were still at the planning phase and not in the implementation phase. A couple of people had not started or had already identified that they were not going to be able to make the process and were working on their waiver. And a couple of people that responded to the survey that were 7-800 systems and that didn't need to narrowband. not going to bore you through with all of the details. The key issue there, from our perspective, was there were two agencies that do plan on requesting the waiver. What was more of a concern to us, though, was the gap there between the number of agencies who were planning on requesting a waiver versus the number of agencies who are still very early on in the process. We're running out of time to have this completed, and so that, if 50% of the folks are still in the planning phase, we strongly encourage them to begin the waiver process as well in case they're not able to complete everything by the deadline. But overall, a fairly large chunk of identified source, roughly source of funding for the conversion, about 10% is not yet. Another area of concern for us, though, was that roughly a little over half the respondents did not have a documented migration plan. And a project as big as narrowbanding, that's somewhat of a concern. Just more pretty charts and data. I got to kind of skip through this because we were going to see a lot of charts today. But the main concern here is for those that were early on in the process, did they think they'd be completed by the January 1st deadline? Two of them said they're going to submit a waiver, and four are saying they're not going to make it, but they will submit a waiver. And one agency reported that they did not intend to submit a waiver. In order to meet the mandate, there's a couple of options moving over to 7-800 systems. There's a variety, and this may be more of an option in areas where YRCS has a presence, TRWC, RWC, etc. Continuing to reprogram the equipment. Narrowband capable equipment has been out on the market for a significant amount of time, so most agencies should already have that narrowband capable equipment, and it's a matter of reprogramming it to narrowband mode. And of course, moving over to digital systems. I'm going to skip through kind of the considerations for narrowbanding there, but these are just kind of the high-level stuff. Mainly, don't forget about pagers and other non-voice type radios that the agencies might also be using. Cost and funding. While it does not require a complete system upgrade, there can be substantial costs related to narrowbanding, and I've said a couple of times today, those considerations need to be taken into account. Regular budget cycles, grant cycles, etc. Most grant funding now at the federal level that involve interoperable communications do make a provision for narrowband-related activities. Everything from planning, replacement of the equipment, consultants to reprogram the equipment, even the licensing kind of costs. So the federal government, through the Office of Emergency Communications and SAVECOM, has updated their guidance. In the last several years, narrowbanding has been an allowable cost within a variety of different grant programs, not just Homeland Security, but some of the other grant programs as well. On the FCC's narrowbanding website is a link to a lot of the other different potential funding sources. One of the things that I'll mention is that we're really at the end of that cycle. And if agencies are considering applying for grants to help with narrowbanding costs, they need to take into account when the money will actually be awarded and how much money is going to be left in the year in order to get that done. As I said, the federal 2012 grant guidance allows under three different priorities, identifies narrowbanding from a planning perspective, an equipment perspective, and even the integral emergency communications activities priorities. So there are a number of different priorities available to which you can apply for narrowbanding costs. But I should note that some grants don't allow construction activities under them, So you need to carefully look at the specific grant guidance for that grant you're applying for. As Lisa Hanson mentioned earlier, March 2nd, 5 p.m. is the deadline for the State Homeland Security Grant Program. Whole bunch of links here in the presentation, and of course on Homeland Security's, State Homeland Security's website on the 2012 Homeland Security Grant. Moving forward, narrowbanding obviously is the responsibility of the individual licensee, but as a commission tasked with supporting interoperability and systems that are designed for operability, we wanted to make sure that we kept you aware of the progress, and that we're going to continue to conduct outreach on this and reach out to a lot of the different systems. Within our agency, our project oversight personnel outside of our office have been working with other state agencies on their narrowbanding plans and on moving those projects forward. And we encourage systems to continue this process, and if they need help, to call our office, to contact the FCC if you think you are likely not to reach that January 1st deadline. It's much better to have that waiver request paperwork in their in-basket than it is to come around on January 1st and have the complaint filed against you. With that, number of resources in the presentation from our office, the FCC, the publicsafetytools.info has now been updated with all of the different charts that were part of this presentation are generated from their tool. That's also useful for helping planning. Several of the other different agencies and their grant programs that might be able to help. In particular, I want to call out the USDA Rural Development Community Programs. There are a lot of communities within Arizona that can take advantage of that grant program. So we strongly encourage you to look for sources beyond just State Homeland Security if you're looking at your narrowbanding. The FCC's contact information. And with that, I will open it up to any questions the Commission may have. Director Ronchi.
Joe Ronchi, Affairs of Homeland Security. Thank you for your presentation. I'm looking at the numbers there. Is this just budgetary? Is that why it looks like most of the country is sort of in the same position?
We're hearing a lot of both. I know that some agencies, it's been a matter of coordination. For them, it's been a rather complex process. I've been speaking with Michael Mills with Rural Metro, and they're having to deal with it from a nationwide standpoint on upgrading, and so it's taking them time to get through that process. Some of it is simply a matter of we have until December 31st, and we're going to build our project plans through December 31st. But some of it is narrowbanding. We're hearing from some agencies, particularly in rural counties in Arizona, that the funding is not there, and they're looking at complete system replacement. We strongly encourage to look at all the options, not just system replacement, but possibly joining some of the other regional systems that are already in place and ready to go.
Thank you.
But unfortunately, it really is a mix of some not ready, some that are taking a full time, and some that are just complex projects that are going to take a while.
Other questions? Any questions from the phone?
No.
I have a, this commission is charged with interoperability and operability, so narrowbanding isn't clearly within our bailiwick, and we've never been given the money to solve this problem. However, in January 1st, 2013, or shortly thereafter, when some of our public safety brethren systems start getting either shut down or highly penalized by the FCC in this, they're going to be looking for some answers, and over here for some answers as well. So I think it is important. We're continuing our outreach efforts and our education efforts, but fundamentally, to your question, what we're seeing is a lot of people out there who were saying just for years, they'll push back the deadline, they're not going to make us, they'll never shut us off, they'll never fine us. A lot of this sort of attitude And, the FCC is not, they're playing hardball. They're just, we have to get things done, and we wait long enough, and it's going to get done, and that means we're going to have to, have very serious consequences for some people. But I'm very concerned about this. And I think that the survey results, 115 out of 600 or so public safety agencies, is probably certainly not representative. And I think the ones that answer are probably the ones that are actually on top of things. And the ones that didn't are the ones that are not. Very concerning that, 46% or something like that is not done yet here in the state. We're not going to get there, and we're going to have a lot of problems. And so I do think that we need to consider what kind of briefing we need to do for the governor's office and others of the legislature so that they realize that it's happening and they don't all of a sudden just wake up at dawn on January 1st and go, why didn't anybody tell us? Because we've obviously, to some degree, the state agencies have been telling them that the budget issues have gone through a legislative process for correction, CPS, and others. But as a statewide problem, and we're not, as you said, we're not alone. We're going to see it all over the nation. But I do think that in some of the areas, like, for example, with PC Wind, do we have an updated status on PC Wind's waiver? Fundamentally, if you have an entire region that has a significant dollar figure behind a build-out that's going to eliminate this problem within a year or two, I think they have a better chance of going after a waiver than, Joe, agency, public safety agency, who's sitting in the middle of 10 others that have all done narrowbanding, and now you're going to have interference problems, and they're going to have a lot harder of a idea to say, well, everybody around you did it, and you're now interfering with all your neighbors. They are actually going to technically change your license on this date, and you're going to be, from that day, no longer operating within your license. And the penalties are going to be, it will be a driven complaint process, as described, but you will be out of licensure at that point. They're not going to wait and, see if if you haven't applied to change, you're automatically getting changed, and at that point, when you start operating outside of your license, you'll be operating outside of your license. So it's pretty serious.
So, Lisa, let's definitely set up a meeting to brief the governor's office.
Mr. Chairman, Steve Campbell, I share the same concerns here, and the hurry-up rush process that I know your office has done. Lisa has done a very good job of outreach in conjunction with hopefully Homeland Security to make these conferences and seminars and educational processes available for folks to understand what's going on. I'm just hoping, here like in today's meeting, we have two different issues about narrowbanding. Still exist, and we're talking to the 2013 deadline is VHF narrowbanding, where we filed forth with, Director Felix is 700-800 megahertz narrowbanding. I'm hoping that there's not a confusion there, but I know you guys have all done a great job in putting out those information panels, information flyers, and it's been on a regular routine agenda item here.
Dan Wells had a comment.
Thank you, Dan. Please.
Just also in passing, one thing I hear as in my travels is several months ago there was a House bill introduced out of one of the representatives of New Jersey to push the narrowband deadline back 2 years. I was in Trenton a couple of weeks ago. That bill is deader than dead. It has no co-sponsor, and it was attached to a bill that was guaranteed to die. So, if any of that conversation gets out there, that gee, this might happen, that's not going to happen. That bill is cold dead.
Thank you, Dan. Now everybody in the room is nodding in agreement. Any other questions for Justin? Thank you very much, Justin. Next on the agenda is an update from Michael on the National Public Safety Broadband Network.
I think that's Michael.
Let's go in here. All right. A little over a month ago, the FCC published an order that required the PSCC OAC, which is the 21 50 broadband waiver recipients, of which Mesa has, is one for Arizona, to select a numeric identifier administrator by February 8th, and that is February 8th, 1 month after their order came out, not February 8th, a year later.
My little baby.
To complete the development of the numbering scheme by March 31st, and then choose a clearinghouse provider by May 31st. Now, this numbering scheme within the public safety broadband network is all the numeric identifiers needed for all the subscriber gear, like basically a device ID or the equivalent of SIM card for your cell network, and all the identifiers for the infrastructure equipment that makes up the public safety broadband network. So it's fundamental in terms of the infrastructure for the build-outs that are going on in the waiver recipient areas in their jurisdictions. The waiver recipient group had been working with Public Safety Communications Program out of Colorado and vendors in discussing various approaches and how we're going to deal with the key winch portion of this numeric identifier is the PLMN ID, and there were discussions on, does each jurisdiction have their own PLMN ID, or do we have a national singular public safety broadband PLMN ID that makes it an entire network nationwide? So the discussions were going on. So they rapidly put together all the ideas into a single document, which is published out on the PSCR website, so there's the URL there. A short-term solution, the FCC order says, well, you can work on an RFP approach or you can work through a federal agency. Well, given that the waiver recipient groups are singular jurisdictions, there's no singular governance entity that can come up with an RFP, and an RFP process takes a lot longer than 4 weeks. So we worked with the OEC and selected SAIC, which is a long-standing contract provider to the OEC, and many public safety entities and SWICs nationwide have utilized their services. They actually managed the CASM application for the National Repository of Public Safety Communications equipment. The plan is to establish a 1-year arrangement, short-term, where the waiver recipients set the requirements. The OEC will put forth the contract and pay SIAC to establish the numbering scheme and administer. Now, this aggressive timeline is being driven by the FCC needing to make decisions for the waiver recipients, particularly Charlotte, North Carolina, Harris County, Adams County, and the state of Mississippi, who are all under BTOP schedule deadlines and milestones. So, can't say it's all an FCC problem because they're being driven by the request from these waiver recipients to make decisions and move forward. And Charlotte, North Carolina actually is where the Democratic National Convention is. They've got a hard deadline to meet that convention. Long-term solutions, in much of the proposed legislation that's in Congress federally, there is mention of the creation of some form of commission to manage the public safety broadband network. This numbering scheme administration would be part of their responsibility, but that hasn't happened yet. And in discussions that I've been involved with, there's a strong tendency towards requesting state-level authority and responsibility for administering the numbering scheme within the state, because they recognize that states probably have a better idea how their jurisdictions interact, and so working through AZPSIC or through the equivalent of the SIEC, which is our PSCC, at various states to come up with a national yet regulated by states kind of approach. Some of the things that state level administration might oversee would be the establishment of the allocation in the state of the unique identifiers, guidelines on who can be on the network and who can't, how does roaming amongst jurisdictions within the state, and how federal agencies or national agencies like fire service interact with the local jurisdictions, and then, of course, to assure interoperability. I mentioned the PLMN ID. It has been agreed by the FCC and jurisdictions involved to establish a single PLMN ID, which means it will be a singular network. By default, there's a high degree of interoperability. Anybody who's a subscriber here or cell phone, the equivalent has been set up with the equivalent of a SIM card on the public safety broadband network. It will be recognized in Miami, Chicago, Phoenix, whatever. I mean, it'll be, you're on the equivalent of AT&T. Don't move. All right. That brings along issues about managing this numeric numbering scheme because it has to factor in all jurisdictions nationally at the same time. So one proposal is to figure out how many IDs are available, divvy them up by FEMA region, and then within FEMA region by state, and the divvying up would be a weighted blend of population, geographical area, number of crimes, number of disasters, number of UASIs. As a pilot, as a test, Cynthia Cole out of Synergize put together this kind of allocation, and Arizona ended up with 5 million IMSIs, which is the user device IDs, which, given our population and number of public safety entities, both primary, secondary, seems like a lot. But once we start down this road, we'll probably end up with a lot of additional, besides user ID, individual subscribers, machine-to-machine, RFID, and so forth. I mean, the number of IDs needed will proliferate just as we've seen in the cellular networks. Okay, so this FCC order has accelerated the need to get ahead. We've kind of been standing back and letting it gel in terms of waiting for legislation and real-life funds behind the scenes to move before we started, really getting into this. But unfortunately, in my mind anyway, this numbering scheme issue, and along with it, the third bullet point, the PSCC has formed a governance working group to make recommendations on how the public safety broadband network should be managed. Again, being driven by the very real fact that we're divvying up numbers, we're allocating numbers, and how are those numbers going to interact in terms of local jurisdictions and neighboring jurisdictions and so on and so forth. We'd like to get input from the PSCC and SIAC regarding the proposals put forth by these working groups, and basically open up who'd like to be involved. Or any other groups that we might engage on this.
So, Michael, I have a question. So, as they allocate these IDs, is there? So, I'm going to relate it to networking. So, I mean, is there concept of a subnet mask so you can allocate a specific kind of?
There are about 15 different IDs. Some of the IDs are temporary to assure efficiency and so on and so forth in terms of, I don't have to go back to the home network to identify this individual every time they get on the network or switch cell towers.
Yep.
They can kind of cluster, and it's a whole new jargon to get going on this stuff, because LTE is in its infancy even in the commercial world.
Right.
And so public safety, lucky public safety gets to live the pain just like anybody else. But to your point,
Yeah.
The issues around all that numbering and all that, I think we avoided a lot of pain and agony by going with a single PLMN ID, because that kind of unifies the users. But then it brings on other issues of
Managing.
An example is Basic Hotels, when they ran their cost models, found that they would have to bring on all government employees to float the costs of the maintenance. That brings in strata of first responders, secondary responders, public works, so on and so forth. So it really emphasizes the issue of having a good set of governance in terms of who has priority on the network when, things like that.
Right. Other questions, please?
Steve Gamble, what kind of time frame are we on? Because, I mean, I'm going to admit I'm going to admit quite a bit of ignorance when it comes to this area, because I think it's still evolving, and I think to answer your question about what other groups should be involved, as a commission, I think we probably might want to have a little more information as far as where we're going and what kind of time frame you might be working on.
Well, and agreed. And I was hoping not to bring any of this up until the FCC put out that order and said, okay, it's time to move. Again, it's only 21 jurisdictions currently. It's not national, and it won't be a national until there's legislation and funding. So somewhere between, my concern is making sure that you're aware that this temporary solution is going to be put in place really soon, and those temporary solutions have a tendency to evolve into the long term. So we aren't asking for your decision or input right away. It's just making sure you're aware of it and how should we act and how should we move forward representing Arizona.
Sure. Thanks.
And if you want more information, let me know and we'll provide it.
So Mike, help me just understand this a little bit better. So are the feds kind of running this from a centralized perspective, or are multiple states kind of collaborating on this?
It's the waiver recipient group is the primary drivers because they're being driven by their VTOP grant deadlines and milestones. Okay, and so you've got VTOP, the waiver recipients, the OEC and the FCC, and ERIC, which is the federal entity that's part of FCC that's supposed to be driving the public safety broadband. But a very small group, relatively.
Right. Absolutely. So what's the BTOP's role? Those groups?
There were 7 or 8 BTOP grants, some in the ballpark of $54 million, some big dollars.
Right.
And they're basically driving as a normal BTOP grant and have their milestones and have their schedules and so on and so forth. There have been some decision points that had to be deferred on some of these grants because the schedules wouldn't permit going through the governance and so forth needed to make a decision, so they kind of left it by the wayside.
Right. So there's some pretty immediate deadlines that are going to kind of be moving forward on this, right?
Right.
So I don't know that we know enough to kind of take action or move forward. I mean, is there more information, would you say, kind of progressively on this?
They just formed that governance working group this week.
Okay.
As information evolves and comes out of that, I would definitely be reporting back to the PSCC and requesting input on it.
Can you go to the dates?
Sure. Let's go back.
So I'm looking at the dates. They're going to be making some decisions between now and May.
Right.
We only meet every other month.
Right.
So Michael's just simply saying, if anybody wants to work with him on this, we're tracking it, from our office's perspective.
Right.
He's going to stay active in it, and we'll ask the same thing of the SIAC and our interested parties list as well. Anyone who's got, obviously we work with maybe Toast Paths and Tucson, et cetera, who are our waiver, either recipients or waiver requesters in our state who have an interest in this, early adopters.
Right.
But if anyone else, he wants to make sure that that sort of they're setting a stage now between now and the summer that may have impact on what it looks like in the long term. So we just wanted to make sure that you're telescoping that.
Yeah, even if it's an email list of interested parties, again, because we only meet every other month, it's kind of difficult to, actually last week it dawned on me, oh my God, I better take the opportunity.
So if anyone does have interest, please, email Michael. We'll get you guys plugged in. Otherwise, Michael, we'll look to you to continue to keep us informed and educate us on this as we move forward. Thank you very much. Next agenda item, Justin, to present on NECP Goal 2.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Commissioners, again. Now I have the pleasure to go over with you some of the results from last year's monumental National Emergency Communications Plan Goal 2 observations and evaluations. All 13 non-UASI counties were evaluated last year, and the final reports have now been issued on them. And today we are releasing and publishing the Arizona Compendium of Findings and Recommendations from the NECP Goal 2 observations, as well as discussing with the Commission today kind of some of the aggregate high-level results from these observations, areas where we saw a great amount of success and areas where there's still work and improvement needed. First, as everyone knows, the NECP identifies a number of areas for improvement that was initially drafted following the events of September 11th, and one of the key reasons was it established a number of priority areas that needed to be improved on and set benchmarks for those improvements. And in particular, required public safety agencies to be able to demonstrate that we could meet those benchmarks. So that's where Goal 2 came about. In 2010, it was Phoenix and Tucson UASIs went through their Goal 1 process, where the federal OEC came out and evaluated them, each of those on major events. And then in Goal 2, OEC required each of the states to evaluate our own non-UASI jurisdiction, and by the exact same criteria as Goal 1 was. The definition there of response level communications is the capacity of individuals with primary operational leadership responsibility to be able to manage resources and make timely decisions during an incident. So that is the definition of what every jurisdiction in the country now has to meet within 1 hour of a routine event, planned event. And so from that definition, OEC developed a set of criteria and required each state to measure both capabilities data and performance data to be able to demonstrate NECP compliance. Last year both last year and in 2010, as part of Homeland Security's Target Capability Assessment, the capability side of that equation, that data was collected, and then the performance side was measured over a series of events in all 13 non-UASI counties. Worked with each of the counties and their county emergency manager, and in some cases a event point of contact to identify events, to go out there and assess their ability to demonstrate that response level emergency communication. A couple of the criteria on the event, they had to be managed in accordance with NIMS, the National Incident Management System, and they should be large public gatherings that required participation from multiple public safety agencies and jurisdictions. From the events that we observed, those 13 events, over 116 different state and local public safety agencies and NGOs participated. We had 12 different tribal agencies involved and 6 federal agencies. So a really tremendous number. I think that's about 134 different agencies were involved and assessed at some point over the past year during this event. 32 people served on at least one or more of our observation teams. From a national standpoint, as of the end of January, there were 22 states that had reported to the feds both their performance and capabilities data. As of October 31st, there were the 22 states that met the deadline, reporting both that information. And as you'll see, Arizona was one of those states that submitted all of the information on time. Map there is as of January 31. More data continues to come in. So following the observation, each county received a after-action report that provided a summary of what the observation team observed throughout the time, made some recommendations, and identified kind of some of the best practices that were followed throughout the event and some of the areas needed for improvement. Those after-action reports were then shared with each of the counties and the participating agencies. They had the ability to provide comment back to our office, and then the final version went back out to the county and the Department of Homeland Security. From all 13 of those after-action reports, we've now gone through and compiled a list of all of the recommendations that were made over the course of these different observations, and kind of generalized them in some fashion because we've made the commitment not to share the specific AARs, and we wanted to make sure that this compendium was of value to the entire state as a whole. This compendium that you have before you, and I should mention it's also now online. We did not print out individual copies. It's 57 pages long, but if anybody would like a hard copy, please see one of us, and we'll be happy to get you either the handbook size or the full book size, depending on your eye level. But the compendium includes some of the best practices that were identified, lessons learned, as well as the recommendations that were made throughout these. And this compendium is going to be useful, we think, both for counties to compare their individual results to how the rest of the state did, but also in terms of helping plan for future events. In particular, there is each element that was evaluated, there is a section on exactly what OEC requires under those sections, what it needs to have that advanced demonstration level. The compendium is broken down, in fact the observations were broken down into 3 main areas: common policies and procedures, responder roles and responsibilities, and communication systems quality and continuity. And again, I want to highlight, going back to that definition of OEC's what response level communications. It's not just about the handheld radios, but it's about everything that contributes to the ability of leadership to be able to make decisions and communicate effectively. So right now I'd kind of like to go through a summary of high-level aggregate results from Arizona, starting off with the common policies and procedures. Each observation team, beginning actually before the event occurred with our request for incident action plans and standard policies and procedures, every observation team went through and reviewed the procedures that were provided. We did interviews with event leadership to ask them about their policies and procedures, whether they were documented or whether these were long-standing protocols that may not have been documented. For element 1, interagency communications policies and procedures were common or consistent amongst all responding agencies. For the most part, it did fairly good. We had, on this particular case, all 13 counties at least had some type of policies and procedures that were consistent throughout all of the agencies that were involved in the event. 3 counties had all cases, were all there. One of the things we did find through these observations, though, was there were a couple of items that kind of foreshadowed how a county would do overall, and in particular, policies and procedures. If an agent or a jurisdiction was lacking a significant amount of policies and procedures, that tended to foreshadow the results throughout all the other elements as well. Were they written? In 2 of the cases, it was the policies and procedures were not written, and for 4 of our counties, most of the time, or all the time they were. Again, there was that big dividing line there between were these policies and procedures written, did they have the consistent policies and procedures, and in particular, a full incident action plan and a tactical interoperable communications plan and TICB or equivalent. Element 2, were those procedures actually followed throughout the event? For the most part, the procedures were, and that was one of the bright points for almost every one of our counties. And were there established policies and procedures for request, activation, deployment of communication resources? This is one where we have a lot of work to do as the state. And for only 4 of our jurisdictions did they have documented policies and procedures for the deployment of communication assets, et cetera. The 4 counties, though, that did have those procedures followed them in every single case. This is one in particular that our office will be working on over the coming year and assisting counties with the development of TICBs that really kind of specifically addresses just this element. On element 3, and as I'm going through this, I should mention that there is a chart within the compendium of all 14 of these elements. If you want to see all 14 of the elements there, there's roughly 27 total questions across all of them. Were the policies and procedures consistent with NIMS? Roughly a quarter were completely consistent, a quarter were mostly consistent with only a few variations, and a quarter had some problems that needed to be addressed.
Big monkey.
And unfortunately, there were 3 counties that did not have policies and procedures consistent with NIMS, period. Priority order of communications. Did the policies and procedures that an agency had establish a priority order for how those resources would be used, meaning life safety issues over property issues, that type of a thing. 4 of the counties had the procedures and they followed them and used them throughout all of the time. 1 of the counties did have it documented and it was used most of the time. But again, as we saw in the previous element, a fairly large number of the agencies or jurisdictions did not have procedures that documented what the priority order is for the use of those resources. This is also another element that can be addressed through the development of county techniques. Primary interagency talk path. Was there a talk at the event that specifically allowed communicators or responders from across different agencies to communicate, and primarily at that kind of the command and control leadership level? This is one that we did fantastic on. All 13 events had a primary interagency communications talk path. In 11 of the cases, these were established by procedures prior to the event, and in 2 of the cases, it was established ad hoc the day of the event. I should say, if you have questions throughout, please interrupt, because this is a significant amount of data, and I don't want to have things just kind of skipped over for you, so please interrupt me if you feel the need. Element 6, common terminology in plain language. Did an absolute fantastic job of that throughout the entire state. 4 counties, there was some coded substitution used during the event. Only in 1 incident was plain language. Whoops, these are kind of backwards here, but only in one instance was plain language really a problem, where it was used, or coded substitution was used throughout the event. Plain language was used none of the time during the event. But for the most part, Arizona did really well on plain language, and there were no problems in any of the agencies any of the events observed. No problems were noticed, both at a primary operational leadership level or down at the responder level due to a lack of common terminology. Element 7 is very similar to Element 6, except for clear unit identification procedures. For the most part, again, we did solidly well. 7 counties, most or all of the time, had common identification for procedures. How the responders would be identified in that multi-agency event. Only in one county was there a problem with that on the very low level. 5 counties had some issues involved that had recommendations for improvement, but for the most part, Arizona did fairly well on Element 7. And again, kind of that same breakdown. First was primary operational leadership, 7.2 is for the response level, emergency personnel. Common channel names for designated interoperability channels, Element 8. This primarily were all the responders when they were on an interoperability channel. Was that channel consistently identified? Was it consistently in the Incident Action Plan, the ICS 205? If the radio had visual display, did it use the same consistent naming? If there was a policy or procedure that documented a mutual aid channel, did that follow the exact same naming convention? For the most part, again, 11 counties, all or most of the time during the events used common names throughout their communications plan. Standard names as in the NIFOG for PSCC channels. There were some cases where this was not used, and so it's an area that we've identified that we'll be working with those counties. As you know, last fall, actually even earlier today, we updated the priority programming guide and the statewide interoperable channels plan, and that plan was specifically designed to help address some of these elements that we're talking about right now. So as that gets pushed out and as agencies hopefully do their narrowbanding conversion, we'll see some much greater improvement on these last couple of elements here. Now moving, and as you can see, there were 14 questions overall, 7 of which dealt with the policies, procedures there in the Section 1. So it's a rather large segment of the evaluation processes defined by OAC deals with policies, procedures, and that type of thing. Responder roles and responsibilities. This gets more now into was the event managed according to the National Incident Management System? Did it follow the Incident Command System? Were principles of unified command followed? How was span of control addressed? That type of thing. On Element 9, were there multiple organizations with inherent responsibility for some portion of the event? Were they joined in a unified command? And was there a single individual designated with Ops Section Chief responsibilities? Overall, 10 of the 13 counties had a single individual specifically designated. Only at 3 events was this kind of an issue. And as you'll see in the recommendations, that there are some recommendations that specifically deal with this. I think this is tremendous progress overall, but as you can see, NIMS ICS has been around for quite some time. And so we are hoping this number would have been a little bit higher, actually. Excuse me. Span of control was maintained amongst the primary operational leadership, both from the operations section chief, and then at a responder level. This one, I think, was a little bit disconcerting. Span of control is identified at 7. A couple of the times where span of control was exceeded, it primarily had to do with issues where if there were NGOs involved in the event and were part of the command structure, but maybe didn't make it onto the organizational chart. And therefore, from a span of control standpoint, they weren't taken into consideration until now. The ops section chief is actually directly dealing with those NGOs as part of lost child recovery, those types of things. So that was one instance where span of control would have been exceeded and might have been able to be identified had it been in the IAP earlier on. Down at the first level, it was much more, span of control was much more of a problem from the ops section chief level than it was beyond that at the first level subordinate. 9 counties had no span of control problems whatsoever. On element 11, now we kind of move into the COML role. Again, over the past year, the PSCC office has done a tremendous amount of increasing the visibility of the COML role, increasing the amount of training available in the state. With your support, the SIEC support, the establishment of the Arizona COML Regional Recognition Program. This element specifically addressed that. Was there a COML designated specifically during the event? In 10 of the counties there was, in 3 of the counties there was not. Just like with policies and procedures, the lack of a COML, whether the incident commander or his designee, the lack of specifically designating somebody to be the communications leader for that event was one of those, I'm trying to come up with the right word. Predictors, thank you. One of the predictors of an event's overall success. And just as Susan will mention when we get to the multiple project updates, there are more COML classes coming up. This is an area that we're going to continue to be doing outreach on and work on over the coming year. Were those roles and responsibilities carried out either by the incident commander, the COML, or someone else? And from this standpoint, this question is looking at, was the ICS 205 filled out by the COML? Was the COML the one that was activating any gateways that they needed to be activated, or calling for them to be activated? Was that the person that was making sure to manage cache radios and all of the functions that a COML should be doing? Was that person doing it? Or was somebody in a different branch of the ICS structure handling different parts, and was there that kind of lack of coordination there? And here we're kind of about half and half on whether the COML actually did everything or how much of it was done by the COML. In some cases, there just wasn't a COML designated, and therefore none of those responsibilities were actually done by anyone. Were communication resources effectively ordered? For the most part, 10 of the 13 counties, they were all ordered, or most were ordered effectively, and they had the resources available. In one instance, not applicable there, that particular event did not have a need for any communication resources on top of the responders' day-to-day operational radio that they always had on there. So that's why there is an NA on this particular slide. And that same NA here, and again, even though we're roles and responsibilities, procedures comes back up. Were those procedures ordered using documented procedures? And so if an agency did not have documented policies and procedures for how communications assets were to be ordered, they fall into that none-work category on this. And again, this is something that can be addressed through the development of techniques or other similar policies. Was a communications plan established by procedure developed early in the event? All 13 counties, this was a yes on. Did the plan meet the needs of the primary operational leadership? In 7 counties, yes, and 6 counties, no. In looking to the communication systems themselves, the element 12, this element, no more than 1 out of every 10 transmissions was repeated amongst the primary operational leadership due to failure of initial communication attempts. The OEC guidance on this question is not you need to sit there and count every single transmission, add it up throughout the whole day, and then see if it makes that 10%. The guidance on this from OEC was there approximately 10% or more? Did they have significant communication problems? Were there issues of radio traffic that needed to be repeated due to whether it was a transmission interference issue, whether it was a lack of understanding due to plain language, those types of things. This question was getting at, did the primary operational leadership have more than 10% of the time a problem being able to communicate? 9 of the counties had absolutely no problem. In 4 counties there were problems for general communication. And again, you'll see those 3, 4, 5 numbers consistently throughout here. On element 13, upon failure or overload of any of their primary communications mode, a backup was provided. The first is, did an event have a backup resource available? Sometimes it was errors was documented in the IAP as a backup resource. Sometimes it was a portable repeater, those types of things. In 9 of the 13 events, there was a backup resource that was specifically identified. And 10 of those events did not have the primary mode fail at any time. In the 3 instances where the primary mode did fail, in all 3 cases, the backup was effectively provided. So this is another one of those cases where Arizona, I think, did very well, particularly on the technology standpoint. Then element 14, getting back to the definition of response level emergency communications that OEC has provided, was the primary operational leadership, were they able to communicate adequately to manage the resources during the incident or event? This is kind of that overall question. How did they do? In 5 cases, there were no problems at all at any time during the event, and the primary operational leadership was able to successfully manage the event. For 5 counties, most of the time, it was successfully able to. And in 3 counties, there were communications breakdowns. Throughout the compendium, these kind of recommendations, you'll see a variety of recommendations that are made in there that kind of relate to both this element and other areas that contributed to element 14. This element in particular is not a standalone element. This is one that all the other previous elements, failures in those elements can impact the ability to be able to successfully pass this question. So overall, that is how Arizona did. There were a number of successes that we identified. There were also a number of challenges that we're going to be working on over the coming year. Our next steps, one, we encourage jurisdictions to compare their after-action report to the compendium. The compendium is going to be distributed to all the emergency managers and the agencies that were involved in the event. So we encourage them to compare these recommendations to the recommendations they see, to be able to match how they're doing with how the rest of the state is doing, and also to use it for future planning events, to identify what are the benchmarks of performance across all of these levels. From our office standpoint, we'll be using these results to better target our planning and support activities. In particular, I've mentioned TICP development. We have already begun working with Coconino County, as Mark mentioned earlier. Immediately following their event, their community emergency manager and Sheriff gave us a call and said, what do we need to do? Let's get this TICP done. It's on hand. Targeting of communications unit leader training, as Susan will mention next. We have a number of COMEL courses coming up. We'll be working on developing and distributing template policies and SOPs to help address some of those gaps, particularly in that first section that dealt with things like priority order, documented procedures for deployment of assets, those types of things. We'll also use it in both the development of our federal grant applications, and then as the SWIC's office, we have to review all grant applications to deal with interoperable communications, and so we'll be our review will take these reports into consideration. Any other support for technical assistance, and the effort that we'll be doing over the next year or 2 years, coming years, to support counties in their improvement efforts. With that, I want to take a moment in particular to thank Jeff Crane. You haven't seen much of Jeff over the last few weeks because he's actually working part-time with broadband. But for the last year, now I guess it's been a little over a year and a half, he has been the project manager for the AZPSIC Goal 2 project, managed all of the logistics and coordination for this major undertaking. So I want to thank Jeff in particular, plus all of the people, 32 people who served as observers during the events of the 130 some odd agencies that participated. With that, I would like to open it up for any questions.
Thank you very much, Justin. Any questions or comments? Okay. I know some of you have some engagements that you have to get to.
We're going to ask them the questions.
Yeah. Perfect. So, Susan, not to put the pressure on you, but
for those of you that don't have a copy of this document, it is available on our website. And since you all have it, I'm going to open up the floor for any questions.
Excellent. Thank you. Any questions?
Our next meeting, May 35.
Yep.
Don't have to slide into that.
All right. Actually, it's on the last page of this. There is an SIEC meeting next month, March 13th. The next PSCC meeting will be April 17th. Same location.
Excellent. Okay. Anything else from anyone? Okay. With that, this meeting is adjourned. Thank you very much.
Thank you.